name is Natan Silnitsky, and I'm a backend infrastructure team lead at Wix.com. And Scala 3 is such a major breakthrough and milestone for the Scala community, with so many great new features, and especially more clear and opinionated syntax. But migrating an existing code base to Scala 3 seemed to me a bit daunting. And for that reason, I wanted to experiment and see what does it really take to migrate to Scala 3. So today you will see how I migrated an open source library that we maintain at Wix. And you will hear all the lessons that I've learned. And hopefully that will encourage you to try it out for yourself, for your code base. So the open source library that I migrated is called Greyhound, like Anton mentioned. And Greyhound is a Scala and Java high-level SDK for Apache Kafka. And it's powered by Zio. So it has both functional API and Scala Future API. And this library has a lot of very cool features, and it's used quite widely around Wix. So more than 2,000 Wix microservices use Greyhound as a library or as a service if it's on other technological stacks than Scala or JVM. And if you don't know Wix, so Wix is a website building platform that allows you to manage your online presence and also manage your business online. And like I said, Greyhound is used by Wix heavily, and also, of course, outside of Wix because it's an open source library. Because it's open source code, it's really easy to share with you all the code changes that I do in this talk. So each code base starts off from a different starting point when it wants to migrate to Scala 3. Maybe you will need to upgrade your build tool to a version that supports Scala 3. And also, maybe your code base hasn't been migrated to Scala 2.13 yet, perhaps. So first you'll need to migrate to 2.13 and then only migrate to Scala 3.1. Specifically with Greyhound library, it is currently built with Scala 2.12, although Wix has migration efforts ongoing heavily around this time and throughout this year. And it is built with the Bazel build tool. So that has some lacking support for Scala 3. So the journey that we'll see today is first switching from the Bazel build tool to SBT, then migrating the 2.12 to 2.13, and most of the talk is about, of course, the migration from 2.13 to Scala 3.1. So the first step was here to make SBT work, and the reason that switching from Bazel is that Bazel doesn't support fully Scala 3 yet. It's supposed to support it by the end of this quarter, actually. That work is currently in progress. Also, I chose SBT because SBT has a really nice migration plugin, and it has dedicated syntax for having interoperability with third-party libraries and all kinds of other nice syntax for such a migration support. And migrating to SBT here mostly involved changing manipulating the structure of the code in order to make it be in the layout that SBT automatically scans for source main Scala, source test Scala. Of course, you can specify the SBT any structure you wanted, but I think this made it much easier for me to do the switch like this. And I compiled and tested and saw that everything is okay with SBT 4.2.12. And here you can see the SBT setup file for Greyhound. And so other than specifying Scala version, all I had to do is just specify the root third-party libraries that I depended on. And that was enough to make everything work. which is cool. Okay, so then I needed to first switch to 2.13, right? The reason to do that is that there are all kinds of helpful plugins and compiler options that allow you to more easily migrate from 2.13 to 3.1. So unlike previous Scala versions. And like I mentioned earlier, the interoperability between these versions is very well. So you don't really have to do full-blown migration. You can do it a lot more gradually and lazily. So for migration to 2.13, change Scala version and fix any errors in third-party library dependencies. So sometimes you have more work on third-party than your own source, your own code-based sources. So here just need to make sure that all libraries are built with 2.13, and we have the SBT syntax with the 2% symbols, which just means that take the minor Scala version and place it as part of the name of the dependency. So I didn't need to specify 2.13 all around here, just use the 2% symbols syntax. And then we need to make sure that all of the code still compiles and runs with 2.13, including the third-party libraries. So I don't think there were any issues with third-party libraries. All of these versions also supported 2.13, not only 2.12. And in order to support and fix errors in the source code, I used the Scala fix tool. So here you can see that you just need to add the Scala fix SBT plugin. And Scala fix is a very helpful tool that allows you to apply semantic rules, basically changes to your code for the entire code base. Specifically here, we can use rules to have successful migration to 2.13. Interestingly, Scala fix uses Semantic DB, and Semantic DB offers a standard data model for all the symbols and types of the source code. And it allows you to decouple between the producers of this data model, which basically is the compiler and, that goes through the source code, and the consumers, which can be all kinds of tools that are set up to read the Semantic DB format and do all kinds of changes. And Semantic DB is not only useful for Scala; it can be for a lot of other languages. So it's a helpful tool for doing interoperable stuff and doing more visibility around code bases. So it's really important for you to know about if you're involved in this area. Okay, so the biggest error that I faced when with the 2.13 code change was type mismatch between map view and map. So a refresher about 2.13 collections. 2.13 collections allowed to have a more explicit syntax for the idea of lazy versus strict. So when you have this very popular pattern of group by a collection and then mapping the values, the map values actually returned in 2.12 a map, but it was actually not eagerly evaluated, but lazily. So anytime you use this result of map values, you ended up evaluating all of the items again and again. So that made a performance impact. So in order to make things more explicit, they changed in 2.13 to map values to return a map view to showcase its lazy nature. And if you want to actually use the strict version and not to reevaluate because you're at the end of your collection manipulation process, then you just specify to map, make it strict, and all of the users of the result won't suffer a performance penalty, which is great, but it does mean you have compiler breaking your code here when you migrate to 2.13. So I wanted to use Scala fix tool, which means that like I did the addition of the SBT plugin, I added here the migration rules to 2.13. I downgraded the version back to 2.12 in order not to have compilation errors, so Scala fix will work correctly. And I added the Semantic DB Scala option rules and compiler plugin in order for Scala fix to work correctly. Then I ran Scala fix with the rule specifically that's supposed to help with this map mismatch with map view, and it seemed to run successfully, but it actually didn't work. I verified that other rules do work, like syntax procedure and stuff like that. So Scala fix was set up correctly and worked. Specifically, this rule didn't work. So I opened a ticket in the relevant GitHub repo, and hopefully I get this result. In the meantime, I just fixed it manually. You can also, of course, do some simple script that changes according to some regex. It's not that hard to do by yourself. And that was it. So once I fixed it, code compiled and test run successfully for 2.13. And now we get to the main course, to the actual migration to Scala 3. So like I mentioned before, we're migrating from 2.13 and not from earlier versions because we have great interoperability, especially around class path and third-party library dependencies. So Scala 2.13 compiler can actually read the newer formatting of the syntax of Scala 3 with the tasty format. So Scala 2.13 are actually already forward-looking and forward-compatible to be able to work with Scala 3, which is amazing. And also Scala 3 was developed in such a way that it can actually read the 2.13 pickle format and see all the signatures from 2.13, meaning that we have full binary compatibility, full class path compatibility between the two versions, which is great and also really simplifies the migration. In terms of how to migrate, well, with SBT, all you have to use is the SBT Migration Plugin, which is really, really convenient. How to use the SBT Migration Plugin? Well, all you need to do is add this SBT plugin to the plugins file. And then we have 4 different commands. We have migrate libs that actually checks that you have all the third-party libraries in a version that supports either Scala 3 or Scala 2.13 if you still want to have it, if you don't have a version for Scala 3 for this library. Second command is migrate Scala C options. So this command checks that all the Scala compiler options are valid for Scala 3. And then you have migrate syntax. This step actually checks and for any incompatibilities of syntax between 2.13 and 3, and then it will go and fix the syntax. And then we have the 4th command, which actually does the migration and rewriting of the code in order to have successful compilation done by Scala 3 compiler. Okay, so specifically running migrate libs command on Greyhound yielded this result. So a lot of the libraries already are compatible. The version is already compatible with Scala 3. For a few, there was a need to specify 2.13 to keep them on 2.13 in order to, because this specific library version doesn't support Scala 3. So remember I talked earlier about the two percentages operator that actually specifies globally the minor version, the major minor version of the Scala version here. But now when we upgrade to Scala version 3.1 or above, it means that this operator will actually skip to a new version and may fail to download because it doesn't exist. So you could have this handy feature of SBT where you say, for this library, don't use the Scala 3 version, but instead use 2.13 version. So you keep the syntax nice and clean, and below, and when SBT actually checks for downloading the third-party library, it will actually go and fetch the 2.13 version. Great. So next step is migrate syntax. Like I mentioned, any incompatibilities between 2.13 and 3 in terms of syntax. Now, specifically here in Greyhound case, mostly it added the explicit return type for the values and definitions. And then when I tried to compile it with 2.13, it actually caused a few extensive compilation errors, mostly around Zio environment area. And because it has a lot of different types. And as I realized that these changes are not mandatory in order to actually successfully migrate and have the Scala 3 compiler successfully compile, I decided to not go and understand how I'm able to fix all of these code areas, but just instead roll back the code in order for it to still compile with 2.13 and move on. And then I reached the final and most important step here, which is the migrate rule, the migrate step. And this rule just compiles the code with 2 different options. First, it compiles with source-free migration, and then it compiles with rewrite option. It's as if you will put the Scala option yourself in SBT. So this Scala compiler option actually turns on migration mode, meaning that the compiler will forgive on most of the dropped features because this is 2.13 style codebase, and it will print warnings instead of errors. And this means that we can read these warnings and be able to fix them. I mean, the compiler will be able to read the warnings and fix them by using the next compiler option, which is rewrite. So in rewrite mode, the compiler just takes all the warnings and resolves them, fixes anything that needs to be fixed in order to remove the warnings. And it's important to note that rewrites are not applied if the code compiles in error. So this is the main reason why I needed to roll back the previous step, because the code has to compile successfully in 2.13 in order for it to actually migrate successfully to 3. So I skipped the previous version and only did this version for now. Another important note is that you cannot choose which rules are applied. The compiler will run all of them. Okay, so I ran the migrate step, and then I hit another issue, another error, which is that it couldn't download a Semantic DB jar that it needed because it doesn't exist for 2.13.8. Okay, so I tried, it failed to download it. So I tried to downgrade to 2.13.7, and for that, the plugin did find the version, and that really didn't affect Greyhound, still compiled successfully. So I kept going with the migrate step, and it did run all the migration actually successfully. Other than one issue, which is some error around Zio tests. But I knew that I wasn't on the highest level version of Zio test, so I tried to upgrade first Zio to a newer version, and it actually made the error go away. So that was very cool. But of course, sometimes third-party libraries can cause you issues. But hopefully, as time goes by, less and less of these issues will occur with newer and newer versions of the third-party libraries. So now I want to show you quickly how this migrate step actually works. So I typed migrate and the SBT project. So first, it compiles the code in 2.13. And there's only a few warnings, no errors. And then it compiles the test code in 2.13. It just wants to make sure that no compiler errors are here in order to continue with the migration itself. So then we have the actual we have the actual migrating steps in this flow. Like I mentioned, adding the migration flag for the Scala compiler option, and it's running. It actually emits warning for 27 candidates. It emits all the warnings, and then it finds all the files, and only for production code. And then it employs the rewrite option. Like I said, it goes and fixes all the warnings by actually changing the code base. Next up, it compiles the test code with this migration flag, and then it looks for, it emits the warnings with these candidates that I mentioned, and then it runs rewrite, and it's done. It's successfully migrated to Scala 3.1, and all it remains to do is go to the SBT file and change version to Scala version 3.1. Also, we can review all the changes that were done reloading from disk here, and we can review all the changes that were done to the code base. Specifically here, lambda input param, it has to have parentheses around it. That's one of the changes in order to compile with the Scala 3 compiler. Then just running one of the tests, the integration tests here, to make sure that not only the code compiles, but also the test runs successfully with Scala 3.1. So you can see that because I changed to Scala 3 in SBT file, then tests are running, test environment has started up and successful. And then we can see that all of the test cases have completed successfully, and we have no errors. Amazing. So this is basically the final step, and we have all of the changes in place. We have Scala version changed, and even tests are successfully finished, so that's great. So I switched the version to 3.1, and now I can commit the change and be happy. Amazing. So let's review quickly the possibilities to migrate in other build tools other than SBT. So like I said, with Bazel, we have a work in progress to support the Scala 3, should finish very soon. Gradle, Mill, Maven all support Scala 3 with various versions. You may need to upgrade to this version in order to get support, and the Scala Maven plugin and stuff like that. And all of these have support for, some support for cross-compilation of your libraries for 2.13 and Scala 3, but you will need to verify it by yourself. I didn't actually check it yet for Greyhound. Okay, and the most important thing, what can you take away from this talk for your migration journey? So takeaway number one, use migration tools. Avoid doing all of this manually. It will save you a lot of time. You have a great Scala compiler option features that are really robust and really make things easier for you. I did need to do some SBT clean operations from time to time just to make sure that everything between moving to different versions and stuff like that, making sure that nothing weird remains out there, but it really was quite successful. Takeaway number two, if your codebase is built with something before 2.13, you will first have to switch to it. And I'm really pleased with the way I saw the interoperability between 2.13 and 3. I really think it's not going to be like the Python 2.13 situation, because Scala compiler is really lenient about 2.13 syntax, and we have the class path interoperability. So we're really in a great place here. Takeaway number three, switch your syntax lazily. You don't have to switch all your code-based syntax to the new shiny syntax of Scala 3 all on day one. like I mentioned, Scala 3 compiler is really lenient. And so you can first make sure that you compile with Scala 3, and then later on change syntax at your own pace. You have the migrate syntax plugin, and maybe you can use that at the later stage. And but you don't have to use it right off the bat. Okay, takeaway number 4. Better to be on SBT. So maybe this is a bit controversial, but SBT does allow you to have the nice SBT plugin that really has an ordered way of going through the migration. But the main feature of the migrations are actually found in the Scala compiler itself with the compiler options. So you can use any build tool to do the migration. You may have a little bit more manual work, a bit less with SBT. And quite surprisingly maybe, or thankfully, you can use your favorite library even if it only supports 2.13 at the moment. You don't need to figure out an alternative library or something like that. You can keep your old libraries that are still only support 2.13, which is amazing. And I don't have any takeaway about macros because there are no macros found directly in Greyhound code, but I'm sure that this area is one of the bigger pain points of migrations if you do have them, because macro syntax has completely changed with Scala 3. But other than that, I think it was really encouraging to see all of the tooling found, especially for migration from 2.13 to Scala 3. So you can find all the process I had in different pull requests and commits in this dedicated repo on GitHub, Greyhound-SBT, that you can go and check out for yourself. And I put here all kinds of resources I used for the migration, how to install ScalaFix. Most importantly, the last one, it's a very detailed step-by-step migration guide for Scala 3. And you should definitely check it out before starting the migration. And I also recommend checking out Greyhound if you're interested in working with Kafka. It has a lot of cool features like changing dynamically the level of parallelism in each of the Kubernetes pods or EC2 instances that you're running on, like making it work with more throughput, less throughput, and also the ability to use all kinds of retry policies to make sure that your consumers and producers successfully perform their operations, in distributed systems. It's really important, and all kinds of other cool features. So I highly recommend you to check that out. So this is where I thank you for listening.